The wind howled across the barren mesa like a wounded animal, carrying with it the bitter cold of the high desert night. Thomas McCready pulled his woolen coat tighter as he stepped onto the rough-hewn porch of his cabin, the wooden boards creaking under his boots. The lantern in his weathered hand cast dancing shadows against the adobe walls, its flame flickering against the relentless gusts that swept down from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. At 28, Thomas had grown accustomed to the solitude of his small cattle ranch on the edge of Apache territory. 3 years had passed since he'd settled this harsh patch of New Mexico earth. 3 years since he'd fled the ghosts of Missouri and the war that had taken everything from him. The isolation suited him fine, or so he told himself during the endless nights when only the coyotes and his own thoughts kept him company. He was about to retreat inside when a sound caught his attention, something that didn't belong to the desert's nightly symphony. A low, pained moan drifted on the wind, barely audible above the howling gusts. Thomas raised the lantern higher, squinting into the darkness beyond his small corral where his horses shifted nervously. "Hello," he called out, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. "Someone out there?" The moan came again, closer this time, and Thomas stepped down from the porch. His boots crunched on the frost-covered ground as he moved toward the sound, the lantern's glow revealing little beyond a few yards in any direction. The moon was nothing but a silver crescent, offering precious little help in the vast emptiness. Then he saw her. An Apache woman lay crumpled against the stone foundation of his cabin, her long black hair matted with dirt and blood. Her buckskin dress was torn and stained, and her dark skin had taken on an ashen pallor that spoke of exhaustion and pain. But what stopped Thomas cold was the bundle clutched against her chest, a small form wrapped in a tattered blanket. "Jesus," he breathed, dropping to one knee beside her. Up close, he could see she was young, perhaps no more than 20, and desperately thin. Her breathing was shallow and labored, each exhale forming small puffs of vapor in the frigid air. The woman's eyes fluttered open at his approach, dark, intelligent eyes that held a fierce determination despite her weakened state. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper emerged from her cracked lips. "Please," she managed, her English heavily accented but clear. "The baby not mine." Thomas felt his heart skip. The bundle in her arms stirred, and he caught sight of a tiny fist emerging from the blanket, pale skin that spoke of mixed heritage. The infant couldn't be more than a few months old. "Ma'am, you need help?" Thomas said, setting the lantern aside and reaching toward her. "Let me get you inside where it's warm." But the woman's grip tightened on the child, and her eyes grew wide with desperate urgency. "No time," she gasped. "They come, they follow. Must protect." Her voice faded as her strength ebbed, but her gaze never left his face. In those dark eyes, Thomas saw something that chilled him more than the desert wind. Absolute terror, and beneath it, a plea that transcended language and culture. "Who's coming?" he asked gently, but the woman's eyes had already closed, her body going limp against the cold stone. Only the slight rise and fall of her chest assured him she still lived. Thomas looked down at the baby in her arms, now beginning to fuss and whimper from the cold. Whatever storm was coming, whatever danger pursued this woman across the unforgiving desert, it had just arrived at his doorstep. And with it, a choice that would change everything. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the distant sound of hoofbeats. Thomas didn't hesitate. Years of surviving Confederate raids and Apache skirmishes had taught him that thinking too long in a crisis could get you killed. He scooped the unconscious woman into his arms, careful not to disturb the baby nestled against her chest, and carried them both inside his cabin. The one-room dwelling was sparse but warm, heated by a stone fireplace that cast flickering orange light across rough wooden furniture. Thomas laid the woman on his narrow bed, then quickly moved to extinguish the lanterns and bank the fire, plunging the cabin into near darkness. Through the single window, he could see the glow of approaching torches cutting through the desert night. The baby began to cry, a thin, hungry wail that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Thomas felt panic rise in his throat. If those riders were hunting this woman and child, the sound would give them away instantly. "Come on, little one," he whispered, gently lifting the infant from the woman's arms. The baby was so light, so fragile, that Thomas feared he might break something just by holding it wrong. He'd never been around children, but desperation made him resourceful. He found a clean cloth and dipped it in water from his pitcher, then placed it against the baby's lips. The crying stopped as tiny lips began to suck at the moisture. The hoofbeats grew closer, and Thomas could hear voices now, rough, angry voices calling out commands in English. He counted at least 4 men, maybe 5. Moving carefully in the darkness, he positioned himself near the window where he could see out without being seen. 5 riders approached his cabin, their horses breathing hard from what must have been a long chase. The men were a hard-looking bunch, bounty hunters by the look of them, with guns hanging from their belts and cold determination in their faces. The leader, a tall man with a gray beard and a star-shaped scar on his left cheek, dismounted and gestured for the others to spread out. "McCready," the scarred man called out. "We know you're in there. We're tracking a stolen Apache woman and a half-breed baby. You seen anything?" Thomas remained silent, his heart pounding. The baby had fallen asleep against his chest, its tiny fist curled around his shirt button. Behind him, the woman stirred slightly, but didn't wake. "We ain't looking for trouble with you, McCready," the man continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "But that woman's got something that don't belong to her. Something worth a lot of money to the right people." One of the other men, a younger fellow with nervous energy, spoke up. "Maybe he ain't here, Garrett. Place looks empty." Garrett. Thomas recognized the name now. Jake Garrett, a notorious bounty hunter who worked the territory between Texas and Colorado. His reputation was as black as his heart, and he wasn't known for taking prisoners. "Oh, he's here," Garrett said with certainty. "Horse tracks lead right to this cabin, and they're fresh. Question is, McCready, you gonna make this easy or hard?" Through the window, Thomas could see Garrett signal to his men. 2 moved toward the back of the cabin, while the other 2 flanked the front door. They were experienced at this kind of work. Thomas looked down at the baby sleeping in his arms, then back at the unconscious woman on his bed. Whatever secret she carried, whatever had driven her across the desert with a child that wasn't hers, these men meant to extract it by force. He thought of his own losses, his own reasons for fleeing to this remote corner of the territory, and made his decision. "I'm armed, Garrett," he called out finally, "and I don't take kindly to strangers threatening me on my own land." A cold chuckle came from outside. "Smart man, knowing my name, but you're outnumbered 5 to 1, and we ain't leaving without what we came for." "Then you better settle in for a long night," Thomas replied, checking his Colt and making sure his Winchester rifle was within reach. "Because nobody's taking anything from my property without a fight." The woman's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. For a moment, confusion clouded her features, but then awareness returned. She saw the baby in Thomas's arms and tried to sit up. "Stay down," Thomas whispered urgently. "They're here." She nodded weakly, understanding immediately. "The baby," she breathed. "Her name, Maria. She is the daughter of—" But her words were cut off by the sound of splintering wood as Garrett's men began their assault on the cabin door. The cabin door exploded inward with a thunderous crash, sending splinters of wood flying across the room. Thomas had positioned himself behind his heavy oak table, the baby Maria cradled in his left arm while his right hand gripped his Colt. The Winchester lay across the table, ready for when the revolver ran dry. 2 of Garrett's men rushed through the doorway, guns drawn, but the darkness worked against them. Thomas fired twice, the muzzle flashes illuminating their surprised faces. The first man spun and crashed into his partner, both tumbling back outside with curses and shouts of pain. "Told you this wouldn't be easy," Thomas called out, already reloading. The baby had awakened at the gunfire, but remained surprisingly calm, as if violence was nothing new to her young life. "You just made a big mistake, McCready." Garrett's voice boomed from outside. That baby's worth $5,000 to the right buyer. You really want to die for Apache trash? Behind him, the woman, Thomas still didn't know her name, struggled to sit up against the headboard. Blood had seeped through the bandage he'd hastily applied to a wound on her side, but her eyes were alert now, burning with determination. "Listen to me," she whispered urgently. "Maria, she is daughter of Colonel Harrison. His wife, she was my sister." Thomas felt the world tilt beneath him. Colonel James Harrison was one of the most powerful men in the territory, commanding Fort Union and overseeing all military operations against the Apache tribes. If this baby was his daughter, "Your sister married Harrison?" Thomas asked, keeping his voice low while watching the broken doorway. "No," the woman said, pain flickering across her face. "She was taken during raid on our village 2 years ago. She fell in love with her captor, had his child, but when Colonel found out, her voice broke. He killed her, called her traitor to her people." The pieces began falling into place. A half Apache child with a powerful white father who wanted her existence hidden. Bounty hunters willing to kill for $5,000. And this brave woman who had risked everything to save her sister's daughter. "What's your name?" Thomas asked. "Ayana," she replied. "It means eternal blossom. My sister, she was Eatsel. She loved the white man's world more than our own. It killed her." A flaming arrow suddenly shot through the window, embedding itself in the wooden wall near the fireplace. Thomas quickly stamped out the small fire it started, then peered through the broken glass. Garrett's men had spread out, surrounding the cabin. They meant to burn him out. "Ayana," Thomas said, making a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Can you ride?" She nodded weakly. "If I must. There's a root cellar beneath the cabin with a tunnel that leads to the barn. My grandfather built it during the Apache Wars." Thomas gently placed Maria back in Ayana's arms. "Take her and get to my horses. They're the mare named Sage. She's gentle but fast. Head north toward the river." "What about you?" Ayana asked, though they both knew the answer. "Someone has to hold them here long enough for you to escape." Thomas checked his Winchester, counting the remaining cartridges. "Besides, this is my land. I'm not running from it again." Another flaming arrow struck the cabin, this one catching the roof thatch. Smoke began to fill the small space as Thomas pulled aside a wooden crate, revealing a trapdoor in the floor. "What?" Ayana asked, cradling Maria close. "Why help us? You don't even know us." Thomas looked at her. This fierce Apache woman who had crawled across the desert to save a child that wasn't hers, who had trusted a white stranger with her sister's most precious gift. In her eyes, he saw something he'd lost long ago. Hope. "Maybe because we all deserve a chance to protect what matters," he said simply. "Now go. I'll give you as much time as I can." Ayana placed her free hand on his arm. "Thomas McCready," she said, speaking his name like a prayer. "If we survive this night, I will not forget your kindness." As she disappeared into the tunnel with Maria, Thomas turned back to face the burning cabin and the men outside. Through the smoke and flames, he could see Garrett approaching the front entrance, confident that his quarry had been flushed out. But Thomas McCready had learned something important during the war. Sometimes the only way forward was to make your stand and fight for what was right, even when the odds were impossible. Especially then. The roof beam above Thomas groaned ominously as flames spread across the cabin ceiling. Smoke stung his eyes and burned his lungs, but he maintained his position behind the overturned table, Winchester ready. Through the broken doorway, he could see Jake Garrett's silhouette approaching, confident that the fire would drive out his quarry. "Come on out, McCready," Garrett called, his voice echoing through the burning structure. "Place is coming down around your ears. Don't die for nothing." Thomas waited until Garrett stepped fully into the doorway before speaking. "Funny thing about dying for nothing, Garrett, seems to me some things are worth the risk." The bounty hunter's eyes widened as he realized Thomas was still inside, still armed, and far from surrendering. Garrett dove sideways as Thomas fired. The bullet splintering the doorframe where the man's head had been a split second before. "You crazy fool," Garrett shouted from outside. You're going to burn alive in there." But Thomas was already moving. The flames had given him an idea. If the cabin was going to burn anyway, he might as well use it to his advantage. He grabbed a burning piece of thatch and hurled it toward the pile of hay near the barn where two of Garrett's men had taken cover. Within seconds, the dry grass caught fire, forcing the men to retreat to their horses. The distraction gave Thomas the opening he needed. He burst through the rear window in a shower of glass and wood, rolling to absorb the impact before coming up running toward the rocky outcrop behind his property. Bullets whined past his head as Garrett's remaining men spotted him, but the combination of darkness, smoke, and his intimate knowledge of the terrain worked in his favor. From his position among the rocks, Thomas could see the barn where he'd sent Ayanna and Maria. Relief flooded through him as he spotted fresh hoof prints leading north. They had made out. Now, he just had to survive long enough to follow. "Garrett," he called out, his voice carrying across the chaos of the burning cabin. "You want to know where they went? Come and get me." It was a calculated gamble. Thomas knew these rocks like the back of his hand, had used them for target practice countless times. Garrett and his men would have to approach across open ground, giving Thomas the advantage despite being outnumbered. The bounty hunter was too experienced to fall for such an obvious trap, but his greed overcame his caution. "Boys, spread out. He's got nowhere to run now." What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse among the desert rocks. Thomas used every trick he'd learned during the war: patience, timing, and precise shooting. When the sun finally began to rise over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, only 3 men remained standing. Thomas had taken a bullet through his left shoulder, but Garrett's force was down to just himself and one nervous younger man. The bounty hunter's confidence had evaporated with his numerical advantage. "This ain't over, McCready," Garrett shouted as he and his surviving companion retreated to their horses. "That baby's still worth $5,000, and there's plenty more hunters who'll come looking." "Let them come," Thomas replied, though his voice was weaker now, blood loss beginning to take its toll. "They'll find the same thing you did." As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the morning air, Thomas slumped against a boulder, exhaustion overwhelming him. His cabin was a smoldering ruin. His shoulder felt like it was on fire, and he had no idea if Ayanna and Maria had truly escaped to safety. But then he heard it, the gentle whinny of a horse approaching from the north. Through his pain-blurred vision, he saw Ayanna riding Sage, little Maria still cradled in her arms. She had circled back, unwilling to abandon the man who had risked everything for them. "Stubborn woman," Thomas muttered, but he was smiling as she dismounted and hurried to his side. "Stubborn man," she replied, examining his wound with practiced hands. "You could have died. So could you. Why did you come back?" Ayanna met his eyes, and in them he saw something that made his heart skip despite the pain. "Because some things are worth the risk," she said, echoing his earlier words. "And because Maria needs more than just one protector in this world." As she tended to his wound with strips torn from her dress, Thomas looked out over the vast New Mexico landscape. Somewhere out there, Colonel Harrison and men like Garrett would continue their pursuit. The territory was still dangerous, still unforgiving. But for the first time in years, Thomas McCready wasn't facing that uncertain future alone. In saving Ayanna and Maria, he had found something he thought he'd lost forever: a family worth fighting for, and a reason to believe that tomorrow might be better than yesterday. The desert morning was cold, but the warmth in Ayanna's touch promised that spring would come again, even to the hardest ground. Spring came early to the mountain country of northern New Mexico that year of 1884. Thomas McCready watched the greening valley of his new homestead while coffee heated on the cast-iron stove he'd installed in their kitchen. The aroma mingled with the scent of fresh bread that Ayanna baked every morning, a domestic routine that still surprised him with its simple beauty. The shoulder wound had long since healed, leaving only a puckered scar that ached before storms. More profound changes had taken root in the months following that burning night when everything he'd built had turned to ash. The ruins of his old cabin lay 50 miles south, overgrown now with sage and wildflowers, a monument to the man he used to be. "Papa, look!" Maria's voice rang clear across the morning air. At 4 years old, she had grown into a spirited child with her mother's dark eyes and a fearless curiosity that kept both adults constantly vigilant. She came running from the barn, her small hands cupped carefully around something precious. Thomas knelt as she approached, noting the serious expression that meant she'd discovered something important. "What have you found, little one?" "Baby bird," she whispered, opening her palms to reveal a tiny sparrow, its feathers still downy and its eyes barely open. "It fell." "Ah." Thomas examined the creature gently. "What do you think we should do?" Maria's brow furrowed in concentration, a gesture so reminiscent of Ayanna that it made his chest tight. "Make it safe." "That's right. Let's find its nest." Together they searched the cottonwood near the barn until Thomas spotted the nest tucked into a fork of branches. He lifted Maria on his shoulders so she could return the chick to its siblings, her face glowing with accomplishment when the tiny bird settled safely among its family. "Every creature deserves a chance to grow up safe," Thomas said as they walked back toward the house. It was a lesson he tried to impart daily, knowing the world she would inherit still held dangers he couldn't always shield her from. Inside, Ayanna was packing supplies into a worn leather satchel. Her hair was braided practically for travel, and she wore the split riding skirt she'd sewn from canvas and calico. After 3 years, she had never lost her restless need to help others, but now she channeled it differently. "The Henderson's baby is coming early," she said without looking up. "Sarah's scared, and Doc Mitchell is still laid up with that broken leg." Thomas nodded. Ayanna had become the closest thing to a trained midwife the scattered homesteaders had. Her gentle hands and calm presence sought after whenever new life struggled to enter the world. It was work that suited her, bringing hope instead of hiding from despair. "I'll saddle Sage," he said. "No need. I'm taking the wagon this time. Might need to bring Sarah back here if there are complications." Their partnership had evolved into something neither had expected during those desperate early days. They'd built this new life deliberately, piece by piece, learning to trust not just each other, but the possibility that happiness could exist without constant vigilance. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Thomas automatically reach for the colt at his hip, a reflex that would never entirely fade. But the rider who emerged from the tree line was familiar. Deputy Marshal John Wesley, a young man with an honest face and a badge that actually meant something in their corner of the territory. "Morning, folks," Wesley called as he dismounted. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Always welcome, John," Ayanna replied, though Thomas noticed her glance toward the satchel. The Hendersons would have to wait a few more minutes. Wesley accepted the coffee Thomas offered and settled into one of the chairs they'd placed on the covered porch. "Got some news I thought you'd want to hear. Jake Garrett's dead." The words hung in the morning air like smoke. Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, a tension he'd carried for 3 years, finally beginning to unwind. "How?" he asked simply. "Shot down in Tucson 2 weeks ago. Tried to collect a bounty on the wrong man. Turned out to be a federal judge's son, and the boy was faster than Garrett expected." Wesley sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Marshal Service is cleaning house these days. Most of the bounty hunters operating without proper warrants have moved on to other territories or found legitimate work. And Colonel Harrison transferred to Fort Robinson in Nebraska last fall. Word is he's keeping his head down, trying to avoid questions about his business arrangements." Wesley's expression grew serious. "Point is, the heat's off. Has been for a while now. Thought you should know officially." Maria had wandered over to pet Wesley's horse, chattering to the animal in the mixture of English and Spanish she'd absorbed from both parents. The sight of her, completely unafraid, talking animatedly to a stranger's mount, crystallized something for Thomas. "Thank you, John," he said, "for everything." After the deputy left, Thomas found Ayanna loading the last of her supplies into the wagon. She moved efficiently, but he could see the careful way she held her shoulders, the slight hesitation in her movements. "The Henderson baby will wait another minute," he said, stepping close enough to touch her arm. She turned to face him, and he saw the same mixture of relief and uncertainty that he felt. "It's over," she said. "Really over. Seems like it. I keep waiting for it to feel different. For 3 years, we've been running towards something instead of away from it, but we never quite believed we'd get there," Thomas finished. He understood. Freedom was harder to accept than captivity when you'd grown used to looking over your shoulder. "What happens now?" Ayanna asked. Thomas considered the question while watching Maria attempt to braid wildflowers into his horse's mane. The animal stood patiently, occasionally snuffling at her small hands in gentle curiosity. Around them, their land stretched toward distant peaks, green and peaceful and undeniably home. "Now we live," he said finally. "We raise Maria to be strong and kind. You deliver babies, and I work the land, and we both try to remember that ordinary happiness is worth more than all the excitement we survived." Ayanna smiled, the first truly unguarded expression he'd seen from her in months. "You make it sound simple. Maybe it is. Maybe we've been making it complicated because we forgot how to trust that good things can last." She kissed him then, quick and warm, tasting of coffee and morning light. "Go help Sarah Henderson bring her baby into the world. I'll be here when you get back." "We'll be here," he corrected, scooping Maria up as she ran past, flower petals trailing from her small fists. As Ayanna drove away in the wagon, Thomas stood with his daughter in his arms, watching until the dust settled behind her wheels. The silence that followed wasn't the tense quiet of hunted people listening for pursuit, but the peaceful hush of a world at rest. "Story, Papa?" Maria asked, settling against his shoulder. "What kind of story?" "Happy one." Thomas carried her inside their home. Solid walls, a stone chimney, windows that faced the sunrise, and settled into the rocking chair he'd built during his first winter here. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and protective, and somewhere to the south, spring rain was washing the last traces of ash from the ruins of his old life. "Once upon a time," he began, "there was a man who thought he had to face the world alone." By the time Ayanna returned that evening with news of a healthy baby boy safely delivered, Maria was asleep in her own small bed, and Thomas was preparing dinner from vegetables they'd grown in their own garden. Normal life, he reflected as his wife's laughter filled their kitchen, was the greatest adventure of all. The desert wind that had once carried threats and uncertainty now brought only the scent of sage and the promise of rain. In the distance, coyotes sang their ancient songs to the rising stars, and Thomas McCready finally understood that some journeys end not in destinations, but in the decision to stop running and plant roots in whatever ground offers peace. Outside their window, the last light faded from the western sky, painting the world in shades of gold and possibility. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight they were home,